Thank you so much for coming today, and I'm going to be speaking. I'll try to speak slowly. Let me know if I should slow down. The paper that I'll present today is a piece of a book that I'm in the process of writing, hopefully nearly done with it, that I've been working on for the past 6 years. My interest in this topic stemmed from the fact that, first of all, I think it's very important that we understand the origins of the disciplines in which we work and the way in which, particularly the 19th century, has shaped the way that we go about our research and some of the assumptions that we bring into our research based upon things that perhaps really aren't relevant to the period under discussion. And this has to do with a larger conversation about the way in which that it's impossible to find to reconstruct events that happened a long time ago because of the extent to which our work is colored by the events in our own time, by the world in which we inhabit. So in a sense, we tend to see ourselves in that past, and I think, automatically are attracted to things that are more familiar, or in some cases, we look for things that are strange or exotic. And so the case study that I'm going to be giving today draws from a very extreme example of that, one that's taken from the history of colonialism in France. And you may wonder why somebody who started off as an early medieval historian working on burial practice has gravitated to North Africa, to a topic that's so different from the place in which I began. But essentially, I was attracted to this topic because I noticed that a number of people in France a number of scholars who became very, very important rather quickly, did some of their training in North Africa. And so originally, when this project began, what I thought I was going to be working on was essentially a history of institutionalization and professionalization of archaeology that occurred outside of France, but influenced the way that archaeology was done within France. But what I discovered in starting the project, that it was something entirely different. And the circumstances that made it different was war. And it was a very, very brutal war, and one which implicated antiquities and implicated archaeology in part of the colonial project. And so that's what this project has become. And I think that it has great relevance, and this is one of the things that attracted me to this project. I'm sure you're all familiar with what ISIS is doing to antiquities in Syria and Iraq. And I think that the story that I tell about North Africa helps to explain some of the antipathy that exists in parts of the former Ottoman Empire towards Roman antiquities, that part of it is a product of European colonialism in parts of the former Ottoman world. I'm not saying that this excuses ISIS's behavior, but perhaps it adds a perspective that helps us to understand what's happening in these places. And it's a history, although I focus on France, I think it's a history that could equally be told in Italy if we think about the Italian colonial project in Libya. And I'm not an expert on Libya. I defer to my colleagues like Stefan Altekamp in Berlin on this topic. But it's important because it helps explain, because some of the ideas that are derived from the North African experience are integrated back into archaeology within the metropolitan state. In the case I'm looking at in France, particularly under the period of Napoleon III in the 1860s, but perhaps that's also true in the case of Italy. So I've divided my paper into 3 parts. The first part of the paper will look at the war itself to give you some background, because I'm not anticipating that many of you are familiar with what the French were doing in Algeria in the 1830s. The next part will talk a bit about the treatment of antiquities in North Africa by the French. And finally, I'll conclude with a discussion of a particular site of importance to give you a case study. So in June of 1827, 2 months after the Day of Algiers, the Ottoman Day of Algiers, insulted the French consul, a man named Pierre de Val, and this event in France is known as the Fly Whisk Affair. And you can see in the image here that the Dey is slapping the face of the French consul with a fly whisk. And this was considered an egregious treatment of the French consul. So the French had they had purchased wheat from Algiers during the French Revolution to supply the French army with wheat, but they had never paid for it. And the Dey was asking the French consul simply to render the funds that were required. But any of you who are familiar with French history know that by the 1820s, this was a different government than the one that had existed during the time of the French Revolution. It was a Bourbon regime, and they felt that they didn't have an obligation to pay back the debts that were incurred during the French Revolution. As a result of this event, the French instituted a blockade, a naval blockade of the city of Algiers on the coast of North Africa. But this had severe implications for the French economy because it prevented trade from issuing from the south of France. And so Charles X, who saw the writing on the wall, he was the Bourbon King of France, he realized that if he didn't do something, he was going to be kicked out of power. So instead, what he did was launch an invasion of the city of Algiers in July of 1830. Now, the invasion was very successful. With 37,000 French troops on the coast of North Africa, they succeeded in defeating the Ottoman Bey. But at the same time, 6 weeks later, despite the success, Charles X was pushed out of power. And this began the regime known as the period known as the July Revolution and the regime of Louis Philippe. So this is some contemporary images of the attack. Now, Louis Philippe, when he came to power, was largely known for having a pacifist foreign colony, but he inherited this poorly strategized regime change in North Africa. In other words, the French, at the time of their invasion, didn't really know what they were doing in North Africa. They weren't sure whether they were going to stay or whether they would leave. But within about a decade, the invasion force of 37,000 was multiplied by 4 times and reached 120,000 by the mid-1840s. And the July monarchy tacitly supported what the French army, which essentially acquired a significant amount of autonomy in North Africa, was doing. In 1837, they expanded the territory under their control to the neighboring Ottoman regime that was based at the city of Constantine. And it became clear after the 1830s that this was not a temporary thing, that the French were really in North Africa to stay. And it's important to keep in mind, in terms of the invasion force, that many of the officers who participated in this event were graduates of a training school in France known as the École Polytechnique. They believed, based upon the ideas of a social philosopher named Saint-Simonien, that they were, or Saint-Simon, that they were going to bring modernization to North Africa. So this was part of the rhetoric of the war, was that it wasn't only for the gain of France, but it was also because they were going to bring, quote, civilization to North Africa. They were also going to bring modernization. They would bring scientific and technological advances that weren't present in North Africa at the same time. Now, at the time of the original surrender agreement in July of 1830, the French general, a man named Bourmont, assured that the French would respect the Islamic religion and the property rights of indigenous inhabitants. But troops almost immediately violated these provisions. From the earliest days of what the French referred to as the pacification of North Africa, the French army, known as the Armée d'Afrique, appropriated people's homes, they turned mosques into churches, they took agricultural land, and in a number of instances, they also massacred civilians of the indigenous population, both Arab as well as Berber. In time, the European settlement grew rapidly. By 1840, there were 27,000 European civilians in North Africa. And I say European because it was actually a significant mix. It wasn't just French colonists. There were people from Malta, from Spain, from Sicily, from Sardinia, from all over the Mediterranean. People migrated, especially Europeans, because their status was automatically higher than that of the indigenous people of North Africa. So by 1850, there were 125,000 Europeans living in North Africa, whereas before this period, it was probably a few hundred. This is a map of French Algeria from the 1840s. The line that goes down the center on the right-hand side, that separates it from Tunisia. That was a separate, that remained under Ottoman control until 1881. Some of the main places I'll be talking about, I've circled. I'm sorry that the writing is very small, but let's see, a little bit further to the south, you can see Constantine. Algiers is further to the west. Now, along with the normalization of violence against the civilian inhabitants and the systematic confiscation of territory in this regime, the French, very importantly, also made claim to the patrimonial heritage of North Africa. And what I mean by the patrimonial heritage is, in fact, in large part, the Roman remains of Algeria. And this is quite different, I think, than, say, when Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1799, because there he came equipped with a team of people who would study Egyptian archaeology. In the case of the French, I don't think they were really anticipating finding a lot of Roman remains. And because Algeria didn't have a Middle Ages, like, say, in Europe, many of these structures were still intact because they hadn't been used, for instance, to build cathedrals or Christian buildings or medieval buildings after this period. Many of these places were no longer heavily inhabited, and so the remains were impressive in French estimation. We know from early in the conquest period that these officers, especially those from the École Polytechnique, and I should mention, the officers who went through this training were very familiar with Roman history. The École Polytechnique had, for instance, a requirement that all officer trainees learn Latin and be able to read it. They also learned how to draw. They learned how to make maps, because that was very important to the military. And they learned about ancient Roman battles. And the very strange thing about the period of the invasion is that when they got to North Africa, they didn't really have any modern maps. And in fact, they were relying on ancient and medieval maps of the region for their sort of understanding of where, like the Antonine itinerary, which is a list of how long it takes to get from place to place. In the 19th century, the French officers were still using that as their main point of reference for this military venture. And so one of the first things that they have to do is they have to start mapping the territory by modern standards so that they could understand where things were located relative to one another and how long it would take to get from place to place, and also what the resources were. Because up till that time, they're reading things like Livy. They're reading the ancient historians to say, North Africa was the breadbasket. So we're going to find equivalent amounts of fertile soil. We're going to be able to use this as an agricultural center, and that will back our own regime. And so we know from contemporary reports, and I won't go into detail, but these officers, when they arrive in these locations, describe the fact that there are Roman remains to be found everywhere. He says there are bricks, tiles, pottery shards, remnants of mosaics, and he says that, and this is a quote from 1832 from a man named Claude Antoine Rosé, who was a captain in the Royal Corps of the Army's General Staff. He says that he sees these antiquities everywhere, and the last phrase is particularly important. He says, "We soon proceeded to visit these places with all the avidity and interest that the appearance of ruins, especially those that recalled the passage of the ancient masters of the world, inspired in sensitive hearts." And what he means by this is that in essence, he identifies with the Roman past, and he sees in these remains something that's very important. Now, I should point out that the Roman remains that were discovered in these locations weren't just inspirational, but they were also practical. The French army, like the Roman army before it, needed water. So one of the very first things that they looked for is where the Romans had aqueducts and where they still functioned, as well as passing legislation to defend the aqueducts from being destroyed, because they knew that they needed a steady water supply. They were interested in where the Roman cisterns were located, and they also looked for Roman fortifications, because these were reused by the French as fortifications themselves. So legislation, such as the piece I've put up here, were issued by the French army that no one was to tamper with the aqueducts, because the aqueducts were still necessary for the French infrastructure, for the French army. They also looked to Roman remains as a blueprint for their own activities. So, for instance, they suggested that, for instance, if the Romans built forts in certain places, if they built roads in certain places, this is where the French army should do the same, because it allowed them to know they trusted the Romans in a lot of ways, and they thought if the Romans were smart enough to do it this way, then maybe we should do it this way as well. Now, they always said, we're not just copying the Romans, we're going to bring our own initiative to this process, because of course the Romans only ruled North Africa for 300 years, and we plan to rule this region for a lot longer. So there was a little bit of a criticism of Roman activities, but at the same time, especially in the first 2 decades, Roman imprint is very important in determining how the French will conquer the region. Yet beyond the confirmation that they felt in coming to this area, I would suggest that some Roman officers, one of them being Armand Jacques Le Roy de Saint-Arnaud, who was very important French general during this period, who later became the Maréchal de France, he also identified very personally with his role and that of the ancient Romans. He said, all of the establishments that I founded in the province of Constantine were dictated by the thought of recreating the Roman occupation. This is the same system I am applying in the west of Algeria. This explanation is to help you understand, Monsieur Maréchal, the importance that I ascribed. I'm sorry, no, I'm quoting the wrong one. So that was Valet. I'm sorry. That was the example of Valet talking about how he made his decisions. But in the case of Arnaud, he identified more personally. He said that when I arrived on the 31st of January and made my triumphal entry into ancient Cirta, which is the Latin name for Constantine, the seat of the ancient kingdom of Juba, Massinissa, Jugurtha, Syphax, my ancient predecessors in the governance of beautiful and rich Numidia. So here he's saying he's part of a long line of invaders of this region. He identifies very specifically, and by referring to Constantine as Cirta, he sort of erased the fact that there were over 1,500 years, well, not 15, at that point it was 1,300 years of Arab rule of the region. There's no mention of that at all. He identifies with the ancient past. So this is where historians of archaeology, including Margarita Diaz-Andrew, whom you'll hear in late May, have argued that this has to do with the way in which archaeology is then implicated in this process of colonial domination. So, but I should point out that despite French attachment to this ancient past, this does not mean that the French treated antiquities in the region very well. And this is an image taken from probably the late 1850s or so, possibly 1860s. And this shows you what the state was of Roman remains in the region after the French essentially had passed through the region. The French used these remains, as I mentioned, to support their regime. And in many cases, they simply destroyed the remains because the cut stone was materiel for the things that the army required. Okay, so they used them to build military barracks, and they built a prison at the Roman camp of Lambesis. They used inscriptions to pave roads because the inscriptions were nicely cut and flat. And so this doesn't imply then a respect for the archaeological remains of the period. Across the territory, the French co-opted ancient fortifications, cisterns, aqueducts, and also destroyed many, many Roman remains. And we know this also because although the French talked about destruction, but in 1873, a German archaeologist and epigrapher arrives in North Africa and cannot believe the devastation before his eyes. He said that more than half of the inscriptions that had existed when the French were there in the 1850s, by the 1870s were gone. So this gives you a sense of the level of destruction, far more than we can see on the continent. Now, in undertaking this project, I had a number of different qualms. And one of them was to talk about the destruction of antiquities at the same time that thousands upon thousands of people were dying. And this is something I think that reporters are also having difficulty with in reporting on ISIS, is that we're not just talking about remains. I mean, we're also talking about human lives. And so I try to find a balance between these two things and acknowledge, too, the destruction that the French were causing on indigenous communities. One of the most famous or infamous events is known as the event known as Les Grottes de Dahra, where the French officers were responsible for lighting a fire at the opening of a cave where over 1,000 civilians had taken refuge, and they died of asphyxiation. And this was news that the French army did not want to reach France, but which was leaked and was sort of front page news on French periodicals at the time. The French also used a policy which was known as the razzia in North Africa. This meant that when tribes rebelled against the French regime, that they would destroy their villages. They would cut down the olive trees, they would take all of their flocks, they would destroy their homes, leaving them to face winter completely exposed. And so a huge number of Algerians died under those circumstances. They weren't directly killed, but they faced very difficult circumstances as well. It's thought that in the 1860s, the humanitarian tragedy grew so great that roughly somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the native population of Algeria died, somewhere between 820,000 and 1 million victims. It's thought that essentially because of malnourishment and then the spread of epidemics like cholera, that as many people died in North Africa as we think died during the Black Death in late medieval Europe in the mid-14th century, except that in this case, the scourge of French policies was largely to be blamed. So there's no question that inanimate objects, such as monuments, have to be kept in perspective in light of the barbarity of the French conquest of this period. The obliteration of these remains operated in tandem with the French army's lack of respect for human lives and livelihood. So at the risk of anachronistic evaluation, it's not much to say that the army's devastation for these sites far outweighed the harm. For instance, we talk a lot in Europe about the impact of the French Revolution and the number of antiquities that were destroyed during this time. And in France, the story is often told of Alexandre Lenoir, who tried to defend medieval remains from the French revolutionaries and created a museum, which is the antecedent of the Musée de Cluny today. But on no level can we make a comparison in terms of the level of French destruction in Algeria. And also in France, often when we talk about cities like Paris, we talk about the Industrial Revolution, not just that, but also the transformation of Paris under Napoleon III and the making of a modern city that we're familiar today with the broad boulevards and the number of medieval remains that were destroyed during this period. And we still can't match the level on which destruction happened in North Africa. And this is in large part because under the conditions of war, you don't have to pay attention to property rights. None of this matters. The French used the territory of North Africa for their own purposes. And in the image you can see here, you see a structure at the camp of Lambesis in North Africa known as the Praetorium. Whether that's right or not is another story. But just behind it, you can see the prison that the French built there in 1850, in part using the stones from the archaeological site to erect a prison to house the prisoners of 1848. These were people who had participated in the Revolution of 1848, and in 1850 they were sent to North Africa. In 1852 they were sent to Lambesis to help build a prison on the site of this ancient Roman camp. This uncomfortable legacy is typically omitted from the history of archaeology of this period. In most narratives that we receive of this period, there is focus on a French archaeological expedition led by Bory de Saint-Vincent, which was sent to North Africa in 1839 to study the antiquities of this period. This mission, which was sort of a follow-up on Napoleon's mission to Egypt, is sort of seen as the starting point and the beginning of institutionalization in North Africa. French officers and civilians are remembered primarily as contributing to the collecting of ancient inscriptions and monuments, such as the image we see here by Captain Delamare. Captain Delamare was a part of this scientific expedition that went to North Africa and played a very important role in the undertaking. But we cannot neglect to mention that the scientific conduct of archaeology in Algeria was an additional tool by which the French authorities cemented their rule of the territory and created what historian Patricia Lorson has called a French colonial space. By laying claim to ruins and especially to inscriptions, and we have a number of accounts of people saying, look, these inscriptions are in Latin, they're ours, and they're not yours. They don't belong to you as a people of North Africa, of Arab extraction. And so we are just taking back territory that belonged to our ancestors, to our predecessors. And the French looked to these remains. The Duc d'Orléans, who was the son of Louis Philippe and one of the officers involved in commanding the French army in North Africa, he wanted to bring back the triumphal arch of Jamila to France. This never happened because it was much too heavy, and unlike in Egypt, there was no Nile to transport very heavy stone northward, so this remained in Algeria. But nonetheless, a statue was erected in North Africa commemorating the role of the Duc d'Orléans. And, but this is part of a longer tradition of bringing back spoils of war and hosting them in the capital of the conquering country. So by the 1880s, 50 years after the conquest, French historians felt comfortable in explaining the history of North Africa as one of conquests. one in which the French were part of a long, excuse me, a long series of conquests, of which they looked most importantly back to the Romans, but which they recognized there were a whole host of conquests in between. But they used this essentially as an excuse for justifying their presence in North Africa, because they said that the people of North Africa could not rule themselves. They relied on outside rulers, external rulers, and now it was the turn of the French. But as the French authorities gained deeper familiarity with the ancient sites and landscape of Algerian territory, there doesn't seem to have been a systematic approach to how they went about doing this work. So in the period that I'm studying, which goes up to the 1870s, it's really very unsystematic. It's similar to France in this period too, thank you, that there's no structure that oversees archaeology in this region until well into the 1880s. In the period I'm talking about, it was very haphazard, it was very insufficient to actually protecting any of the monuments of this region. Although there was lip service given by leading officers to remains, most famous of whom was probably Thomas Robert Bougeaud, he said it was important, but nonetheless he was responsible for destroying these remains. Charles Texier, who I have a quote here, was appointed as the first administrator who was responsible for monuments in North Africa in 1845. He noted that French domination in bringing civilization to Africa is thus connected above all to the great monuments of Roman domination wherever they can be reestablished. And by this he said, we need to keep these monuments because they are markers of our own legitimacy. They help us understand why we're here. Another figure who was very important in this process was a man named Adrien Berbrugge, who was the founder of the first European museum and library in North Africa, the Bibliothèque Musée d'Algiers, and one of the first archaeological societies in North Africa. And he recognized the importance of these monuments, but he profited from the spoils of war. For instance, many of the early manuscripts that existed in the library in Algiers were Qurans that had been confiscated by the French army. He actually accompanied the French army as it passed through various territories and scooped up manuscripts as he found them. And he too recognized that in the early years there had been a lot of destruction in North Africa, but he said that it was justified, that security, this may sound very familiar, this sounds very similar to what the Americans said when they invaded Baghdad. Security is our first issue. There may have been many antiquities that were destroyed during this period, but the ultimate goal was more important. And now that we are firmly established in North Africa, we can take care of these antiquities, although of course for many of them it was much too late. The Minister of War in France was not that interested in antiquities. He said that they were a distraction from the main circumstances for which the French were present. So there's no question that French officers and later civilians approached Roman ruins selectively, and this I should point out as well. It was almost exclusively, so because these were officers who were conducting archaeology in this period, they're mostly interested almost exclusively in Roman remains, and especially Roman remains that have to do with the Roman army. During this period, there's no recognition of Byzantine archaeology. There's very little attention to Christian archaeology, almost not a single mention of the Vandals. They're digging right through that stuff if it's present at all. In their records, they only note the presence of inscriptions and large structures, and the kind of archaeology that they're undertaking is not really what we would call excavation today. It's mostly clearing debris away from the sites they're interested in and copying and drawing the ruins they find, and then collecting a few key pieces that would be brought back to museums in Europe. So, essentially, in this period, officers wrote about the need to save Roman remains, and also the parallel between the Roman period and the French remains. But as I mentioned before, they give attention to the fact that they're not just copying what the Romans did. And Azéma de Montgravier here wrote that we're not proposing to imitate them like just rote to copy them, but rather to learn from their examples and what they might bring. Do you want me to take a stop, or am I okay? Okay, I thought, okay, no, okay, thank you. So even if officers who had more scholarly inclinations considered ancient monuments to be central to their vision of the colony's future, the army had already obliterated a large number of remains in a region that was once plentiful with these objects. Now, there were attempts in the 1850s to preserve these remains. We see in the 1850s the creation of archaeological societies in the cities of Algiers and Constantine, as well as the creation of museums, although the one in Algiers actually goes back to the 1830s, but at the beginning it didn't have a lot of archaeological material. Almost exclusively, they're looking to Roman remains. It's not until the 1880s, for instance, that they begin to look at Arab remains. Byzantine remains also is significantly late, 1880s, 1890s. The hope for a more permanent solution to the conservation of antiquities seemed to reside in antiquarian societies on the model of how they existed in Europe, which is how most archaeological research was published and conducted in this period. The Musée archéologique de Constantine was established, I believe, about 1856. It contained many remains, but the museum faced many challenges, and on a number of occasions, the archaeological remains it collected were, especially those that were too large to be put inside of the protection of a building, were often confiscated by the French army and used for military purposes. And this happened in the city of Cherchell as well, where the mayor of the city of Cherchell actually sold off 300 inscriptions that had been collected by the museum because the French military was building a road and they needed pavement stones for it. They just used the inscriptions for that period. So before the 1870s, the preservation of these remains was extremely haphazard. So I'm going to switch now to a more specific case study to give you an example of how this played out. I'm going to look at a single monument, which is known as the Tombeau de la Chrétienne among the French, and the treatment, excavation, and display of this Roman-era ruin, because I think it helps us to explain the importance of contextualizing archaeological undertakings in Algeria against the backdrop of the conquest and settlement of this territory. Now, this mausoleum first became widely known in France when Napoleon III, on his second visit to Algeria in 1865, sort of passed through the region from which he could see the site in the distance. He wasn't able to come close because at the time there were no roads that led up to the monument, so he could only see it in the distance. His visit was made during a significant moment of crisis in Algeria, because at this time, this is the year just before the massive epidemics, the cholera epidemics of 1866 and 1867, and the famines that were a part of this. Napoleon III, as some of you may know, was very, very interested in archaeological remains of the Roman period. His regime was responsible for purchasing from Italy the Campana collection, and also he was very interested in Julius Caesar in particular, because he believed he was the heir of Julius Caesar, and he undertook excavations at Alesia, most famously, because he wanted to sort of note one of the most important battles of Julius Caesar against Vercingetorix in France. So he put a huge amount of funding towards archaeological objectives, very different than the era that preceded him. His coup happens in December of 1851. His archaeological undertakings really date more from the early 1860s, for the last 10 years of his regime, until the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Now, Tombeau de la Chrétienne was not well known, but was known in certain circles from at least the 18th century. During travels to the region, some famous 18th century antiquarians, among them Thomas Shaw and James Bruce, one being English, the other Scottish, identified this structure and commented on this mausoleum. They identified this pyramid-like structure by reference to a passage that was recorded by the Spanish geographer Pomponius Mela, who described the Mauritanian royal mausoleum as being located at roughly this place. In the 19th century, French scholars recognized it as the burial place of Juba II, the Numidian king of Mauritania, and his wife, Cleopatra Selene, who was the daughter of Antony and Cleopatra. They were loyal clients to the Roman emperors during Juba's reign, which lasted from 29 BCE to 20 CE. And the monarchs established their capital at Caesarea Julia, which is modern-day Cherchell, which was part of the French colony. But their dynasty was not long-lived. Their son, King Ptolemy, did not survive his murder by Caligula in 40 CE. So this essentially was very briefly a royal mausoleum, which had only was only used for a period probably of 20 or 30 years. Now, although Berruguet, who I mentioned to you already, as being the founder of the Musée, the Bibliothèque Musée d'Alger, was very powerful in antiquarian circles, but had no money to excavate. And so during Napoleon III's visit to Algeria in 1865, he petitioned him and said, please, we need funding to look at this important Roman site, because he knew that Napoleon III was interested in this. And Napoleon III, who was curious, possibly having seen it from a distance, said, okay, I will give you 10,000 francs to excavate the site, which for this period was a significant amount of money. Now, Berruguet had been long interested in the site. We believe that he saw it probably in the late 1830s for the first time, and it's west of the city of Algiers, so it wasn't too far from where he was located. And he was interested in it enough to try. He went back on a number of occasions. In the 1850s, he applied for money to excavate the site, and he was given only 500 francs. And he was able to excavate for a period of about 4 weeks. But so you can understand that when he received 10,000 francs for this purpose, that obviously he was very pleased at the outcome. Now, I should talk a little bit about the name Tombeau de la Chrétienne. The French gave it this name because of the what appears to be a carved cross on its exterior, which I don't think is thought to have that significance. It simply perhaps was a coincidence because of the date of the creation of the mausoleum. This makes absolutely no sense. Or because of a mistranslation of the Arabic name for this, which was the tomb of the Roman woman. At some point, it became converted to tomb of the Christian woman, actually. Berruguet's activity at the site was no doubt also because in the majority of the remains, archaeological remains in Algeria, were in the province of Constantine, and he was based in Algiers, which was sort of monument poor by comparison. And so he knew that a similar site, which is thought to have been older at Madresen, had been excavated in the province of Algiers, and so it was also a sort of competition between the two sites. Now, this site was excavated, or at least explored, I should say more accurately, in the 1850s, but the studies were relatively incomplete and inconclusive. So in the 1850s, as I mentioned to you already, Berbuget asked for money to excavate the Tombeau de la Chrétienne. And when I say excavate, I should specify, it mainly meant pulling away the stones that had fallen around the site, and he wanted to go inside it, just like the story of the pyramids. He wanted to find out what, because there were a number of ancient legends circulating that it was filled with treasure. And I would argue that he was trying to get in because he was hoping he was going to find a bunch of gold that would imitate sort of what was happening in Egypt in the same period. He only received 500 francs to undertake this dig. Very interestingly, on this dig in 1855, he was joined by a man named John Beasley Green, whom I'd never heard of before. It turned out he's an American photographer who had previously photographed excavations of the pyramids in Egypt and came briefly to Algeria to photograph this site, which some people thought looked quite similar to the pyramids. In his digs, in order to save money, the Berbuget used the services of the Zouaves. These were light infantry soldiers, which at this point were largely European, although had included indigenous troops in their earlier incarnation. But they were mainly used for moving stones that had fallen off the site away from it so it could be seen more clearly. But most of the work that was being done was they were looking for the entry into this structure. And you can see this picture here taken by Beasley Green in 1855. It's known as the false door because they thought this would be the way in, but it turned out it was not. And for the history, those who are interested in the history of photography, this is the earliest dig that I'm aware of in Algeria, at which photography was used as a tool for archaeology, for helping to document an excavation. These are calotypes. Calotypes were a type of photography that were not good for moving shots. You had to stay still for a very long time to develop these. But the advantage of the calotype over the daguerreotype was that it could produce from a single negative multiple positives, which was not the case with daguerreotypes. But unfortunately, Green died of something he contracted in Algeria about 6 weeks after these photographs were taken. So he died at the age of 28. The photographs went to the Institut de France, and they were never published, but they remain an important record of this excavation. Now, in 1865, when Napoleon III, after his visit, Berbuget got a second try. He got to go back to the excavation, and he brought photographers with him, in this case, those who were using daguerreotypes. So these are single photographs, but also a very important record of the excavations. So in 1865, essentially the funding came in two allotments, 6,000 francs the first time and then close to 6,000 the second, so more like 12,000 francs. Napoleon III gave imprimatur to this excavation. The first thing that Berbuget did was he had them blaze a road to the site because otherwise it was very inaccessible. And the next thing he did was he tried to get into the mausoleum, and this is where much of the money went. He used the money to hire a mining engineer from Algiers who used artesian tools, which are usually used to find water and dig wells, as well as using explosive material to blast his way into the mausoleum. They made over, I think, 13 or 14 probes into the monument. So this is very different from the way we do archaeology today, because these were very invasive techniques which were causing destruction to the monument as they tried to blast into the side of it with explosives. They finally, on their 13th probe, were able to breach the side of the mausoleum, and they found an entrance into the monument. With the help of military explosives to breach the structure, they were able to enter the monument on the 15th of May. This was after 7 months of trying to get into the Tombeau de la Chrétienne. So the image that I show you here is a map that's drawn roughly at this period of the way that they understood this monument after they cleared out debris from the interior, how it worked. Berruguet reported that they first entered into a corridor which led to a doorway guarded by a sculpted lion and lioness. And from there, they were able to clear the debris, and they proceeded up a brief staircase of 7 steps to reach the principal gallery, which wound counterclockwise around the base of the circular monument. And this is the image you can see here. He thought that the space was used for ancient Egyptian ceremonial purposes. At the very center of the monument, the hallway passed through a narrower passageway before reaching the main room, which was at the heart of the structure, and that's the small square that you can see in the middle. And this was what they believed housed the ashes belonging to the royal couple who had been cremated according to a Roman tradition. He was very disappointed to find that there were no treasures, there was no gold. There were many rumors circulating in this period that he would find a lot more than he actually did. In fact, he had a lot of trouble convincing local people to work on this excavation because they were very concerned about going into the structure because a local tradition told them that this was dangerous. Berruguet attributed the fact that there was no treasure to the fact that the mausoleum after the murder of Ptolemy was not guarded, and that in late antiquity the tomb was probably robbed. He said maybe it was also a hiding place for criminals and Christians in late antiquity, but by the time of the Arab invasion he thought that the entrance to the tomb must have been forgotten, that the stones had fallen in front of it, and it's after this date that he thought that nobody really had gone inside the block passageway. So he recounted, and I won't go into great detail about what the legends were in the area, but there were a number of ones which talked about the fabulous finds on the inside, and there were some very interesting stories, and if anybody's interested in hearing about them, about Halula, who was the guardian fairy of the Tombeau de la Chrétienne, who was guarding the riches on the interior. We can't help think that Berruguet, who included an account of these fantastic tales, had himself sought, just like the so-called European discoverers of the pyramids, that he was going to find similar fame and similar riches. He spent nearly 30 years trying to get into the structure, and he used the opportunity to deride native superstition and sort of dismiss sort of these local traditions as inaccurate. His methods of using artesian probes and laying explosives to break open the structure were only marginally less destructive than anything anybody else had caused in this period. And when he only found bone fragments and scattered artifacts on the interior of the Tombeau de la Chrétienne, he had even beaten the walls of the structure with a crowbar to determine if there were any hollow compartments in which more riches might be found. So in the end, it's interesting, Berruguet does not openly admit defeat, but instead he made the best of what the site had to offer to him as its main archaeologist, one who was sponsored by the emperor and could at least take credit for having succeeded in breaking his way into the long, impenetrable Roman-era mausoleum of Juba II and Cleopatra Selene. So what he did was he contacted the most important officials in the Algerian colonial regime. Just a week after breaking into the Tombeau de la Chrétienne, he invited them to come out to the site. On the 22nd of May, 1866, he welcomed the Governor General, a man named McMahon, to the site, his wife and his chief of staff, and a number of other important officials. He alleged that such a large number of people arrived at the scene to witness the opening of the tomb, both Europeans and indigenous people, that some were perched on the graded stones of the monument itself. After a tour for the VIPs, the most important people, of the interior of the mausoleum, the Governor General's staff lit flares on the top of the structure as evening came on, and Berruguet recounted that the effect was more stunning than one had ever hoped, that fantastic reflections on the monument on the spectators at its base, near the entrance of the underground burial place, gave the people and objects a gloomy hue, as if one were transported back 18 centuries at the moment when a nocturnal convoy brought some monarch of Mauritania to his final palace. So his orchestration of these events sort of presage or precipitate a new phenomenon that would be occurring in this region, which is tourism. Berruguet's concern was that the monument, the Tombeau de la Chrétienne, would become in the future a place that people would visit. And he published word of the discovery both in journals in North Africa as well as in France. One of the first steps he did was to commission by a sculptor 2 plaster scale models of the Tombeau de la Chrétienne, one of which would stay in Algiers and one of which went to Paris for the Algerian pavilion of the Exposition Universelle, the World's Fair of 1867. So it was clear from the very beginning he meant to circulate word of the discovery of Tombeau de la Chrétienne and to suggest its importance in understanding the patrimony of Algeria. And he got a local council to, for instance, pay the salary of a guard to stand at the front. So I'll conclude now. However few they were in number and effectiveness, there were French advocates for the benefits of fostering conservation of ancient monuments in Algeria. And one of the greatest was Léon Renier, who was a member of the Institut de France and spent more than 6 months in the 1850s in Algeria to record Latin inscriptions. And these were because, as I mentioned before, that these Roman inscriptions were France's claim historical claim to their domination of North Africa. And Renier himself also recognized their importance for the future economic growth of the Algerian colony, and that was through tourism. He said that these will be, first of all, of political importance, but also their preservation will help to make our colonists better devoted to the history of this place, will make them identify with this territory, and also they will have institutions of which they will be proud. And here he's referring to museums and patrimonial sites that tourists would be able to visit in the future. So even if these ancient monuments were officially ignored, Renier recognized they were important and highly potent symbols of French rule in the region and their claim to the territory. So study of the treatment of monuments and the practice of archaeology in the context of the colonial conquest and the settlement of Algeria sheds light on the ideological underpinnings of French archaeological exploration in North Africa in the course of the 19th century, and it has many lessons for us today. French officers' personal interest in ancient remains, and in some cases their passionate intercession on behalf of recording, if not preserving, evidence of Roman rule of the region, reveals much about their understanding of the military operations they led or in which they participated or from which they hoped to gain. And here, this is another quote just to give you an identification with this area. This would be the area into which the French would go to restore the glory days of North Africa under Roman rule. However, there is no denying that their archaeological activities represented more than just a pleasant way to pass the time when not on campaign. The French were fascinated with the ancient past and also made extraordinary efforts to record, excavate, and preserve some of the fragments of the ancient past. But we cannot forget the fact that it was part of a colonial venture. So I'm going to end my lecture today by just pointing to a single image that Berruguet himself drew and included in one of his publications of the activity. And this is his drawing of the French conquest of Algeria, which imaginally depicts the barbarous but manly Arab warriors who are found on horseback being greeted by the trappings of Roman civilization. And you can see here, it's not that the French invaded with a bunch of women. These are the Muses. They are bringing the civilization of Roman civilization back to Algeria, the gift of the French to the Algerians. By integrating the history of archaeology with the realities of the violence of this military conquest and pacification of Algeria, we thus gain valuable insight not only into the values, priorities, and preoccupations of French colonial occupation of Algeria, but also into the origins of the classical study of the Roman past.
For this, I would say, enlightening. How do you say? Enlightening. I choose always the worst words to talk. And I think mostly for those who are not used to this kind of subjects, this must have been fundamental to understand also that we have to understand the past, and it's very classical. I used to say this is not true, understanding the past to interpret the present, but in our days this subject becomes again and again important in the days in which archaeology, unfortunately, it's coming again in the news because of war, because of what people is doing and manipulating our work, how our work is being manipulating to justify or not a war or an intervention or what is going to happen. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I want to thank also, seeing that we are also online, our friends from the history department. There are many students here from medieval history who wanted to join us today. So thank you for coming. And if any, and sorry, cinema and colonialism also is there at the end, Farapolato. So nice having you all here. Is there any question? I'm sure there are so many questions about this subject. Remember, not questions are unimportant. It can help us also to see what you understood or not. Any question? Can you speak very loud?
So I would say, my project, I'm only looking at the period before the Third Republic, because in 1871, it's made into a civilian province, and that's the point at which things really begin to change. By the 1880s, archaeology is much more institutionalized in this region. So the period I'm looking at is simply officers who go on their own, and a couple civilian missions, including that of Léon Renier to collect inscriptions. So I would say in this period, no. The only time the Vandals are mentioned that I've found is when they talk about the destruction of Roman sites. They say that the Berbers are descended from the Vandals, and that the Vandals destroyed, that they created nothing. So the assumption is that there would be no Vandal remains. The only sign of Vandals is their destruction of Roman structures, and they're associated with the end of the Roman Empire. So unfortunately, no. In the there's the one exception really on the Byzantine period, if you want to consider that, I guess, post-Roman, I don't know. But, following the Byzantine conquest of the Vandals, there's work done by the, I guess you could call him archaeologist, art historian. It's sort of a mix of all of them, is Charles Diehl, who publishes in the in 1883, the first book to be written on Byzantine remains in North Africa. But really, because I think of officers' interests and their activities, that this is really not on the table. And I'm also interested in the Christian archaeology of North Africa. And really, for the most part, it's not acknowledged. Sometimes we know that there were basilicas located very close to where these French officers were operating, and they simply don't mention them, or they mention them in passing. There are one or two attempts to do a little bit of excavation in the 1850s at sites like Tebessa, but for the most part, no. Christian archaeology really starts in North Africa after the creation of the arrival of the White Fathers. So the Archbishop of Algiers, a man named Charles Lavigérie, he begins. He comes to Africa in the midst of the crisis of 1868, and so he is very interested in missionary work, and in that sense, the late antique past is very important because, of course, this is seen as the home of St. Augustine, and this is very important to his discourse. And so he creates a missionary order, which would be known as the Pères Blancs, the White Fathers, and they would do, in addition to their missionary work, they did archaeological work in North Africa starting in the 1880s. And the person in question here is, the most dominant figure in this movement is Alfred Delattre, who excavated sites, and it was seen as part of the propagation of Christianity in North Africa. But the reason it doesn't happen until after 1870 is that when it was a military province of the French, it was a military colony, they didn't want religion to play a very important role in the conquest, because they were afraid of the implications this would have for the indigenous people, and they tried to play down the idea of both missionary work and Christian excavations. So that's why it's pretty late. I'm thinking about returning to Père Delattre for a future project, because his work is really interesting, and I'm interested in the way that it's linked into the missionary process that happens in North Africa. But yeah, unfortunately, I was expecting that Vandal things would be sort of more on the table, but it's mainly used by the French as an insult by saying, when they get to Lambasis, for instance, they say, oh, it's so interesting, like the Berber people in this area, some of them have blue eyes, some of them have light-colored hair. This must be the result of the Vandals. These are people who are descended from the Vandals, and so it by implication, it links them to the destruction of the site rather than playing a useful purpose at Roman sites. So, yeah, so.
Any other question?
Thank you. Have you some information about local reaction of the destruction and French studies and of things? No, local reaction.
Unfortunately, we don't really know. What is clear is that indigenous people were very familiar with these sites. We know from local mosques that they use spolia, just as the French, we can see in medieval France, that there were items from Roman sites that were incorporated into mosques. And if we look at 12th, 13th, 14th century Arab historians, they're clearly familiar with the Roman presence in North Africa. They describe the aqueducts. They talk about Roman military engineering as being very important to the region. Unfortunately, what we don't know in the 19th century is what local reaction is. And I've spent a lot of time trying to locate sources that might suggest awareness of this. At this point, all I can say is that through the eyes of the French officers who were doing the earliest work in the 1830s, they consulted with locals. I found the work of a general named Duvivier, and Duvivier couldn't go, for instance, he couldn't go to Lambasis, and he was based in Guelma, which was ancient Kalama, and he wanted to know what was further afield where he couldn't go safely without a military escort, and he didn't have the time to do it because of his responsibilities in the army. And he says that and he spoke some Arabic, so when local people would come, he would ask them about where antiquities were located. So I think it's clear that the indigenous people had a meaningful relationship with these sites, knew where they were. In some cases, it's possible that there were sort of superstitious stories that were attached to this. But because I'm very interested in Lambasis, for instance, in this case, we don't know how much of the population was actually literate. And so except through the words of these contemporaries, I haven't been able to find independent writings that were done by Arab historians. And the Arab historian, because unfortunately I don't have Arabic, the Arab historians, though, with whom I've consulted, seem to be completely unaware of there being sort of a textual record from the Slate period. And that's why I've gone back to like 14th century sources to show that there was a tradition in Arabic of understanding these places. But in terms of reaction against the destruction of these sites, my reaction would simply be that this was the least of their worries, that these were people who were losing their homes. We know from the 1890s, for instance, in Tunisia, and this is work that's been done by Clémentine Goutron, that there were people living on the site, for instance, of Douga, and they were kicked off the site by the French archaeologists, in this case a man named Carton. He said, you must leave. I mean, they were living on the site. He cleared the site. So in those cases, yeah, the reaction must have been very negative. But the amount of destruction in Tunisia is considerably less than in Algeria. But I think that the French so radically transformed the landscape of Algeria that essentially there was this history was cut. And I think that the French so convincingly made an argument that these are our monuments, not yours, that now in Algerian discourse, if I understand correctly, that these are not seen as part of their, an integral part of the patrimony, except by people who specialize in this. That in places like Algeria and Tunis, Roman sites are mainly seen as sites that are visited by tourists, and they're for tourists, but that they don't have local importance anymore. But I would argue that before 1830, it was different. It's just that a memory of that has been lost because of the effectiveness of the French campaign in suggesting the Roman ancestors were exclusively of Europeans and not of locals. So I don't know if that answers your question, but unfortunately this has been a huge challenge of this project because I wanted to try to also include the indigenous voice, but unfortunately I almost exclusively include it via French officers' reports of having spoken to locals, but I don't have any accounts by locals speaking in their own words. So.
The way they thought themselves as gold or as Frankish, something like that. I don't know if you understand.
Sure. So, I mean, in linking this to that bigger question, I think I think there are phases that occur in which this narrative shifts depending upon the political circumstances in France. So, I mean, my last project looked at the local archaeologists and the way that they excavated. And I argue, in fact, that their argument was largely ignored because as industrialization took place in France and they found all of these cemeteries, which on the basis, whether you agree with the argument or not, but on the basis of weapons, they believed that these cemeteries were Frankish, okay? So, but because the archaeological societies were outside of academia, and the historians who were writing historical narratives of this period were in universities, first of all, there was a significant clash between professional historians and amateur archaeologists, which meant, to a large extent, that the historians were able to discount the work that was being done by archaeologists in the antiquarian societies as amateurs. And in essence, wherever they encountered this, they either ignored what the archaeological societies were doing so that they could continue their narratives of the clash between Franks and Romans and the descent of the French from the Gallo-Romans. So they downplayed the results that were being turned up by archaeologists. And this is particularly true under Napoleon III, who, of course, was interested in the Gallo-Roman past and the Roman past to the exclusion of virtually everything else. But what happens is 1870 and the German war, right? And the invasion and the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. And I would argue at that point that suddenly this past becomes very important, because the Germans, who have been assiduously reading French publications of Frankish cemeteries put out by the archaeological societies, people like Lindenschmidt, for instance, are very familiar with this past. And they use it to claim Alsace-Lorraine since time immemorial as Germanic. And thus, I wouldn't say it's the reason they invade, but it's a very useful discourse to have at hand. And the early work of the archaeological societies in annexed Alsace-Lorraine, which are directed by the Germans, the first thing they do is start to make maps. And they plot all of the Frankish cemeteries that had been identified by French antiquarians. And they make their own maps, which show the extent to which the Franks had taken over Gaul. And this reappears during World War I. And it certainly is being used by the Germans in the 1930s in the events that lead up to World War II. This heritage is absolutely important. And I would argue, though, that there's still attempts by the French as late as the 1930s to acknowledge this Gallo-Roman past. For instance, if you look in the early 1940s, at Vichy, Vichy does almost exclusively Gallo-Roman archaeology. So they don't want to contradict the Germans by directly fighting with them over the results that they're finding and the way they're using Frankish archaeology in occupied France. Instead, under the Vichy government, they look at the Gallo-Roman past as a way of claiming a different past for themselves than the one that the Germans are trying to narrate. So this is a constant struggle, I would say. To what extent Algeria contributes to this conversation, and I think Algeria is a manifestation of it. When I started this project, I was going to try to show how much influence comes from Algeria into France as a result of this identification that you see taking place. But the main thing that I can show, the contribution of the Algerian archaeological experiment in France, is first of all the use of soldiers to do excavations, because this influences Napoleon III at Algiers. He doesn't use troops coming from Algeria, but he uses a military structure, and the digs at Algiers and Gergovie and a number of the other digs he does are all led by military men. And I can't help but think that in part is an importation from the way that the French did large-scale archaeology, possibly. Although they weren't doing such large-scale archaeology in North Africa, but on a number of instances I can show that they used 50, 100 soldiers at a time to do their digging. So I think this is the main legacy of that past. It's also an interest in the Roman past in a way that, I mean, you could see in the south of France, but which Napoleon III tries to make more dominant. But ultimately, it's not all that successful. They wanted to open in the Louvre a wing that was going to be similar to the wing that's dedicated to Egyptian history. They wanted to open one that was going to be called the Musée Algérien. It was going to be a gallery inside of the Louvre. It never happens because the Louvre curator at the time, Louis Courajod, he said that the North African stuff was second rate, that they liked much better the materials they'd confiscated from Rome and that they had from the south of France, that the North African stuff was sort of second rate and he didn't want it in the Louvre. So there was a lot of ambivalence about this past. But it's clear, they're related, but Algeria, I don't know if one could say it proves a lesson, because it's too much, I think, of an offshoot from the main story. But where it becomes very important is shaping classical history, which I think, classical history and archaeology, which I think in large part is so focused on the army because of a result of the legacy that we see here. And the fact that, sort of Vandal archaeology really is something that happens very, very late, not happening in this early period, basically 1950s and afterwards. This unfortunately is, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, okay.
Well, I think we can close with this.
Okay,
Thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you very much. I hope you're having a good time.
Yes.
We had a very good time
Thank
in
you.
this last days.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
we'll see you.
Yeah.